All right, we're here. Chronicles. No, not the Chronicles of Narnia. Come on, people. Not the Chronicles of Riddick. I don't even know if you know what that is. Not the Spiderwick Chronicles or the Vampire Chronicles or something else that I've never heard of Chronicles. It's the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel and Judah. Perhaps a better way to look at it would be that it's the Chronicles of Israel. Chronicles is looking back to look forward. The book is full of curated content from the books of Samuel and Kings, but also some new content and a general history of Israel. Why is it like this? Well, first, let's quickly look at what is here. Then we can discuss why it's here. Chapters 1 through 9 are genealogies. Come on. We love these, right? Adam to Abraham, Abraham to Jacob, Jacob to David, all the descendants of David, then a bit backwards and a genealogy for all the 12 sons of Jacob. The whole thing is very clearly David-centric, as is Samuel, as is Kings, as is now Chronicles. Then we see 20 straight chapters all about David. Chapter 10 is a recap of Saul's death. Chapter 11 to 25 retells the story of King David from a slightly different perspective. Chapters 26 through 29 are more of David's actions as king and the passing of the throne to Solomon. Then 2 Chronicles, chapters 1 through 9 is a retelling of the story of Solomon that we've heard in Samuel and Kings. Chapters 10 through 35 is a retelling of the narrative of Kings, but this time it's only the kings from the southern kingdom. Chapter 36 is the exile and Cyrus of Persia. So why is it like this? I mean, why retell the same stories again? Maybe that's the point, but with an additional purpose and with additional content to prove the point. This actually happens several times in the Bible. Moses retells the story of the Exodus several times, as do the Psalms. For example, Psalm 78 is a poetic, worshipful retelling of the entire history of the Israelites through David for the purpose of temple worship by the songwriter Asaph, who lived during the same time as the book of Chronicles was written. He had a purpose in retelling the story, to worship. So does the writer of Chronicles. His purpose is to look back and look forward to the future king. Look back at what happened and look forward to who is coming. So first of all, look back. It's helpful to look at the stories that appear here, but not in Samuel and Kings, because that will help us to see the writer's purpose. The genealogies are new here. There's a bunch of new information about David, David's mighty men, David's charge to Solomon, David's prayer for his son, which is kind of like another psalm. It's like Psalm 151. It's like the lost psalm, but it's also carrying on the desire for a true king. There's a bunch of information about the temple, patterns, offerings, and like we mentioned before, prayers. There's more info about some of Israel's greatest kings, Hezekiah and Josiah. They kept the Passover. Hezekiah cleansed the temple, all for the purpose of what? Looking back to look forward. Think about who this was written to. These are the people who are returning from 70 years of exile from their land. They've got God's big promises from the Old Testament. The promise of land to Abraham. Check, we got it. The promise of people to Abraham. Check, there's like a billion of us. The promise of the temple to Solomon. That's re-happening. Check. The promise of a coming king like David. We're waiting. So much emphasis then on the kings because this was the thing that was yet to happen. They're like, we've got the land, we've got the people, we're rebuilding the temple, but what about the king? Wasn't he supposed to be like David? In the Hebrew ordering of the Old Testament, Chronicles actually goes last. It's a looking back on all that's happened from Adam to what was then now, seeing what God promised, how he fulfilled it, and then being like, but wait, where's our king? That's the point. Where's our forever king? He's coming, people. Just wait 400 years. Samuel and Kings were written to the Israelites in exile to show them how it happened. Chronicles was written to the people back in Israel to help them anticipate their coming king, Jesus. And we see it very clearly in 1 Chronicles 17. It says, I will establish your throne forever. That's God talking. It's the mirror passage to 2 Samuel 7, remember? Remember how for the rest of Kings, it was like, is it this guy? Is it this guy? Is it this guy? Now we get it from the other perspective. Chronicles is compiled after all of those kings came and went. Chronicles is looking back to look forward. The prophecy is very clearly not about any of them. They're all dead. Rather, it's about the one we're waiting for, Jesus Christ. And this fits right into our narrative of the Old Testament and the whole Bible. God created, man fell, Jesus promised, Jesus fulfilled, Jesus followed, Jesus returning, and the Bible is God's word.
The books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. While they're two separate books in our Bibles, that division is not original. Due to scroll length, the book was divided in two, but it was written as one book with one coherent storyline. Now, in our English Bibles, Chronicles comes after the book. Chronicles is actually repeat content from those books. And so most modern readers, when they come to Chronicles, they think, wait a minute, I just read all of this, and so they skip it. And that's a shame, because this book is really unique and important in the Bible. In the traditional Jewish ordering of the Bible, Chronicles is actually the last book because it summarizes all of the Jewish scriptures. The first word in the book is Adam, the first character at the beginning of the story, and then the last paragraph announces the return of Israel from exile. Now, we don't know who wrote this book, but we can tell from details within it, it was produced by somebody who lived a couple hundred years after the Israelites returned from the Babylonian exile. Now, for this author, Jerusalem and the temple were rebuilt some time ago, and as we learned from Ezra and Nehemiah, things were not going well. The great prophetic hope was that the city and the temple would be rebuilt, that God would come to live among his people, the Messianic king would come, and all the nations would come live under his peaceful rule, and none of that has happened. And so the author of Chronicles has reshaped these stories of David and Solomon and the kings of the past in order to provide a message of hope for the future. And we'll see that he's designed this book to emphasize two clear themes. First, the hope of the coming Messianic king, and second, the hope for a new temple. Let's just dive in and you'll see these themes all over the book. First Chronicles begins with 9 chapters of genealogies, long lists of names. And you'll read these and think that this is kind of boring, and that may be true for you, but actually they're very, very important. The author is summarizing here the whole storyline of the Old Testament by naming all of the key characters in the stories. And as he does so, he shapes the genealogies to emphasize 2 key lineages. First is the line of the promised Messianic king. So lots of space is dedicated to tracing the line of Judah that led all the way to King David, to whom the Messianic promise was given. And then from David, the author traces that line up into his own day. The other family line that receives lots of attention here is that of the priesthood, the descendants of Aaron, who, of course, served in the temple. And so right from the start, you can see the 2 main themes, the author's hope of the Messiah coming to build a new temple, and it's rooted in these ancient genealogies. Now, after that, the author moves into the stories about David, and most of these are going to be familiar to you from the book of Samuel, but again, there's some really important differences. So first of all, the author leaves out all of the negative stories about David, where he's portrayed as weak or immoral. So Saul chasing David around the desert and persecuting him, the story of David's adultery with Bathsheba and then murdering her husband, all of that is gone. And what's left are the stories that portray David as a good guy. And not only that, there's also new additional material that you won't find in the book of Samuel that shows David in a very positive light. So there's a large block of chapters where David makes preparations for the temple. He arranges resources and builders and Levites and choirs. And not only that, the author also portrays David as a Moses-like figure. God gives David plans for building the temple just as he gave plans to Moses for building the tabernacle. So why all this new material about David? The author's not trying to hide David's flaws. He knows that anybody can go read about them in the book of Samuel. Rather, he's trying to portray David as the ideal king in order to make him an image or a type of the future Messiah from the line of David. It's very similar to how Jeremiah or Ezekiel spoke of the coming Messiah as a new David. This is most clear in how the author retells the story of God's covenant promise to David in 1 Chronicles 17. When you compare this story with its parallel in 2 Samuel 7, you'll see that the author of Chronicles is highlighting that neither David, nor Solomon, nor any of the kings from his line were the Messianic king, and that when the Messiah does come, he will be a king like David. And so for this author, these stories about David from the past are what sustain his hope for the future. After David dies, we move into 2 Chronicles, which focuses on the kings that lived in Jerusalem. And again, there's lots of overlap with 1st and 2nd Kings, but there are many key differences. So the author has left out all of the stories about the kings of northern Israel so he can just focus on the line of David. And there's lots of new material about these kings from David's line. He highlights the kings that were obedient to God, and he adds new stories about how their obedience led to success and God's blessing. But he also adds new stories about kings who were unfaithful to God. They didn't follow the Torah, they led Israel to worship idols, and these kings face horrible consequences, all leading up to Israel's exile, a mess of their own making. And so this whole section becomes a series of character studies where the author wants later generations of Israelites to learn from their family history, and so become faithful to their God and the Torah. Now, the book's conclusion is really unique too. At the very end of the book, the king of the Persians is named Cyrus, and he tells the Israelites that they can go back home, return from exile, rebuild the city and the temple. And he says, last line of the book, Whoever there is among you, of all his people, may the Lord his God be with him, and let him go up. And that's how the book ends, with an incomplete sentence. Now, of course, the author knows about the first return from exile and the stories of Ezra and Nehemiah, but clearly, in his view, the prophetic hopes of Israel were not fulfilled in those events. And so, this incomplete ending shows that the author's hope is set on yet another return from exile, when the Messiah will finally come to rebuild the temple and restore God's people. And so the book of Chronicles, it's the final book of the Jewish scriptures. It ends by pointing forward. It calls God's people to look back in order to look ahead, because the past has become the source of hope for the future. So Chronicles concludes the Old Testament as a story in search of an ending. And that's what this book is all about.